A little boy asks Morgan Freeman about life. His response leaves the entire cafe in tears. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional chime of a spoon against porcelain. Sunlight streamed through the cafe's tall windows, casting a golden glow on wooden tables where strangers sat, lost in thought, unaware that they were about to witness a moment so profound it would leave them speechless. A moment sparked not by fame or wisdom, but by the innocent curiosity of a child and the voice of a man who had narrated the world itself. Does wisdom come from innocence or age? Comment 0 for innocence and 1 for age. What happened next moved an entire room to tears. Listen closely and don't forget to share your thoughts. Morgan Freeman was deep in contemplation as he sipped his coffee at one of the tables by the window. The renowned actor, who was renowned for his insight on and off screen, was only relishing the uncommon tranquility of an afternoon by himself today, rather than attending a speech, interview, or even a role. Or so he believed. Liam, an 8-year-old kid, was sitting with his mother across the room, his tiny hands gripping a well-worn book. His sneakers barely touched the floor as his legs dangled from the chair, but his thoughts were focused on something much larger than himself. Liam had always been an inquisitive youngster. Them frequently dismissed his queries with straightforward responses because they were too preoccupied or uneasy to go deeper. However, his questions caused them to pause. He had the opportunity to ask someone else today, though. Someone who appeared to possess the kind of knowledge that came from life itself rather than just books. Liam inhaled deeply before slipping out of his chair and approaching Morgan Freeman, who was seated there. The cafe grew quieter. A few patrons looked up, fascinated by the image of a young youngster confidently approaching a Hollywood icon. Liam paused next to his table and Morgan looked up. The boy's eyes glowed with something deeper than his steady voice. The quiet resolve of a child with a query that no one had ever really addressed. Liam tightened his grasp on his book and said, "Mr. Freeman, what does it really mean to live a good life?" There was silence in the cafe. For the first time in a long time, Morgan Freeman had to hesitate before responding to a question that was both straightforward and deep. Liam was unaware that his innocuous inquiry would spark a discussion that would alter the course of events for everyone in the cafe. The regular rhythm of the cafe had resumed, complete with the steady buzz of voices, the subtle shuffle of footfall as patrons arrived and departed, and the quiet clinking of porcelain cups against saucers. However, time appeared to stop at one table. As his coffee cooled in front of him, Morgan Freeman's intense gaze was fixed on the young youngster in front of him. Liam's question lingered in the air, innocent but substantial, straightforward but unavoidable. What does it really mean to live a good life? Morgan had been answering innumerable questions in speeches, film scripts, and interviews for years. However, this was not like the others. He took a time to examine the youngster, noting how his tiny fingers clutched the book's edges, how his sneakers hardly touched the floor, and how his big eyes conveyed the silent resolve of someone looking for a really important answer. This child wasn't searching for an easy answer. This person was looking for the truth. Morgan put down his coffee cup and let out a deep exhale. "That's a big question," he finally said, "and I think the best way to answer it is with a story." As if understanding that whatever was going to be spoken would alter his perspective on the world, Liam's countenance brightened and he swiftly drew out a chair. Pretending not to listen in, but unable to help themselves, a few heads in the cafe tilted slightly toward their table. Because how many times did you hear a child ask such a question? Morgan took on the comfortable, steady rhythm that had mesmerized audiences for decades as he leaned back in his chair with his hands clasped together and his voice lowered just a little. "When I was about your age, Liam," he said, "I asked my grandmother the very same question." The boy raised his eyebrows in astonishment. "Really?" Morgan gave a warm, deep laugh. "Really? And do you know what she told me?" Liam gave a head shake. As though drawing the recollection from somewhere deep inside, Morgan's voice grew softer. "She said, a good life isn't about being the best. It's about how many people you help along the way. It became quieter in the cafe. The barista even took a moment to listen after cleaning the counter. Liam scowled a little as the words rolled about in his impressionable brain like stones. "So, being a good person means helping other people?" asked the man. Morgan gave a nod. "That's part of it, but it's more than that. It's about how you make people feel. It's about the kindness you leave behind, even when no one's watching." Liam's little fingers traced the cover of his book, immersed in thought. His mind was working through the notion, fitting it together like a piece that had never fully fit before. After a minute, he spoke again, his voice softer but no less solid. "But what if you try to be good," he replied slowly, "and life still isn't fair?" The question impacted harder than expected. A few patrons moved about in their chairs, intrigued. A woman who had been reading a novel by the window dropped her book a little. The fingers of a man who had been bent over his laptop, typing frantically, dropped to the keys. Since Liam had not merely posed a query, every person in that room harbored a dread that he had expressed. With his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden table, Morgan paused before answering. "Life won't always be fair," he said, his voice laden with wisdom. "But that's not a reason to stop being good." Liam's forehead wrinkled. "But why not? If bad people still win and good people still lose, then what's the point?" Once a hive of informal conversation, the cafe was suddenly strangely silent. Adults seldom ever asked that question aloud. They ignored it in favor of simpler solutions. However, Liam had just brought everything into the open, making it impossible to ignore. With a sigh, Morgan leaned forward a little and said in a softer but somehow more forceful tone, "Because goodness isn't about winning, Liam," he replied. "It's about choice." Liam blinked. "Choice?" Morgan gave a nod. "Every day we make choices, to be kind or cruel, to help or ignore, to stand up or walk away. Life won't always reward those choices the way we want it to, but that doesn't mean they don't matter." Liam sat motionless, taking in all that was said. Morgan went on. "You see, kid," he said, "most people think being good is about what you get from it, about whether or not it pays off. But the truth," he lowered his voice even further, "being good is about who you become because of it." A gradual silence descended upon the cafe. The half-listening customers were suddenly completely engaged. As she listened, the barista, who had begun preparing another cappuccino, stopped in the middle of pouring, steam rising from the machine. Liam pressed his fingers into the cover of his book and peered down at it. "So even if I don't see the difference I make," he grumbled, "it still matters?" Morgan nodded and grinned. "Especially then." Liam was silent for a long time. Then he grinned at last. It was a tiny little smile, but it was full of the understanding that most people didn't discover until much later in life. Even though the cafe was now entirely quiet, Liam wasn't finished. His next query would go much further and make everyone in the room face a reality they had long shunned. As though the air had thickened and was pressing against the windows and walls, the cafe stayed motionless. Everyone who had been lured into this unexpected chat found themselves thinking over Morgan Freeman's statements for a while. Liam sat still across the table, his tiny hands on his book's cover, his forehead pinched in concentration. He wasn't finished. He had been harboring something more for a while, something more profound, something unsaid, and now he was going to ask it, with the bravery that only a child has. Liam's voice was gentler this time, as he gazed up at Morgan. "Then why do bad people still win?" Morgan let out a deep, introspective sigh. More to himself than to others, he whispered, "That's the question, isn't it?" Liam waited. There was an uncanny silence in the cafe, which had formerly been alive with the soft sounds of heating milk and soft chatter. A businessman dropped his phone after reviewing his emails. A woman froze in the middle of stirring her coffee. Everyone was anticipating the response. "The truth is, kid," Morgan concluded, "bad people do win sometimes. They get ahead, they take shortcuts, they hurt others and walk away without consequence." Liam sagged his shoulders a little. Morgan caught sight of it. He bent over. His voice was firm as he asked, But you know what I've learned? Liam gave a head shake. They don't win forever. Liam's curious head cocked slightly. Morgan waved in the direction of the cafe. He said, "You see these people? Most of them probably don't remember who was president when they were your age. They don't remember the richest man in town or the person who had the nicest house." Liam looked around the room. Morgan went on, "But do you know what they do remember?" Once more, Liam shook his head. They remember the teacher who told them they were smart when they thought they weren't, the neighbor who helped them fix their bike when they fell, the friend who stood up for them when no one else would. Morgan waited for the words to sink in. That's who really wins, Liam. Every statement found a place in the hearts of those listening, and the cafe stayed motionless. Liam drummed his fingers on the book he was holding. "So being good means making sure people remember you for the right things?" asked the man. Morgan gave a nod. "It means living in a way that makes people better because they knew you." Liam pondered that for a long time. Finally, he gave a nod. "I think I get it." Those who had been listening in silence across the cafe sensed a change. After frantically typing on his laptop for the past 30 minutes, a man in a black suit carefully closed the screen and gazed at the table's wood grain as though he had never seen it before. As though the chat had softened her hands, a barista who had been impatiently checking the time found herself pouring coffee a little more gently. A slow, trembling sigh came from a woman at the back, her fingers wrapped around a wedding ring that no longer had a husband attached. For Liam, this was more than just a lesson. They all learned a lesson from it. Liam grinned quietly, not realizing the effect his query had caused. "I think my grandpa would have liked you, Mr. Freeman," he replied. Morgan laughed. "I would have liked him too." The space was beginning to seem lighter. However, one more thing remained. Liam paused, his fingers digging into his book's cover. Morgan took note. He said, "Something else on your mind?" As though he wasn't sure if he should ask, Liam bit his lip. Then at last he spoke something. He began with a deliberate word choice. "If being good is about how you make others feel, then what if no one remembers you at all?" Once more, the cafe froze. Some took sharp breaths. For the first time that afternoon, Morgan was taken by surprise and blinked. Because whether they acknowledge it or not, everyone is haunted by the one question that Liam had just posed. There was now complete silence in the cafe, yet even Morgan Freeman took a moment to respond. Because life wasn't the only topic of this one question. It dealt with the aftermath of our departure. There was silence in the cafe. It's a heavy silence, pushing down on the air like a dense fog, not the kind that comes from an empty room or a halt in discussion. All of the patrons, baristas, and even the man who had been reading through his phone and half listening were now motionless, because Liam's query had cut through the cacophony of everyday existence. What if no one remembers you at all? With his palms resting on the wooden table and his coffee long since forgotten, Morgan Freeman sat still. He was suddenly at a loss for words, which was surprising for a guy who had dedicated his life to narrating stories and taking audiences into the depths of human emotion. He sensed the room's weight moving in his direction, the implicit expectation that he would know the answer. However, this query, there was no simple solution to this. Morgan tapped his fingers on the rim of his cup and let out a deep exhale. He remarked, "That's a big question, kid," at last. Liam's tiny fingers clenched around the book's edges as he nodded. "I've given it a lot of thought," the boy said. "People always say we should do good things so we'll be remembered. But what if no one does?" One of the women at the counter shifted uneasily in her chair. After sipping his coffee without really tasting it, a man in a business suit gazed down into his cup as though he was looking for something deeper in the dark liquid. Because the truth was, everyone was plagued by this question. Not only a kid, not merely an elderly man, everyone. Morgan's voice lowered just enough as he leaned forward, making the cafe appear to close in around him. "Do you know what happens when a tree falls in the forest, Liam?" questioned the man. Liam blinked, taken aback by the abrupt change of topic. Does it make a sound?" Morgan gave a small smile. "That's what people like to ask. But I think the better question is, Does it matter if anyone hears it? Liam scowled as he considered. I guess not, he murmured gradually. The tree still falls, even if no one's there. Morgan gave a nod. Exactly. Now the cafe was so quiet that it was deafening to hear someone moving in their chair. Morgan went on. A good life isn't measured by how many people remember you, Liam. It's measured by how much of yourself you gave to the world while you were here. Liam furrowed his brows. But what if no one sees it? Morgan gave a little laugh. Oh, they see it, he told him confidently. They just don't always realize it. He scanned the cafe, looking at those who had been feigning indifference but were suddenly paying close attention to everything that was said. You see, kid, kindness isn't loud. It's not always something people write about in history books. It's a teacher staying late to help a struggling student. It's a neighbor shoveling a driveway without being asked. It's a stranger paying for someone's coffee on a day they needed it most. Morgan leaned back and spoke in a steady but firm tone. And sometimes, the people who change the world the most are the ones who never even realized they did. Liam sat silently thinking. The business-suited man rubbed his chin and leaned forward a little. As though something had suddenly been lodged in her eyes, the woman behind the counter wiped them. The barista who had been making a latte even hesitated a fraction of a second longer than needed before pouring the milk. For the first time in a long time, everyone in the cafe was genuinely considering the kind of impression they were making. When Liam did speak, it was hardly more than a whisper. So, it's not about people remembering me. It's about what I leave behind in them? Morgan smiled. That's exactly it. With a slow nod, the boy's face took on a subtle yet significant expression. Then I think I want to be a good person, even if no one remembers me. There were a few silent gasps. The entrepreneur let out a breath and combed through his hair. As though those comments had struck too close to home, the woman behind the counter put a palm to her heart. Since most individuals spend their entire lives attempting to comprehend a reality that a youngster has just proclaimed out loud. Morgan lowered his voice so that only Liam could hear it as he leaned closer. Then, my boy, you've already lived a better life than most. There was no sound in the cafe. Not uncomfortable, not coerced, but the silence that immediately follows a real event. A tiny smile appeared on Liam's lips as he reclined in his chair. His words were, "Thank you, Mr. Freeman." With a laugh, Morgan raised his coffee cup again. "No, kid, thank you." And the whole cafe seemed to let out a collective sigh as Liam went back to his mother, holding his book even more tightly, as if for a moment everything made a little more sense than it had before. A voice interrupted Morgan Freeman as he raised his cup to take a sip. It was someone else in the cafe, and they were asking a question that no one had before dared to ask. Suddenly, the discussion was far from ended. Slowly, the cafe came back to life, but something was different. The coffee makers buzzed again, the discussions restarted, and the sound of spoons clinking against ceramic mugs filled the air, but everything felt different. Still taking in what Morgan Freeman had said, Liam reclined in his chair. The edges of his book were traced by his tiny fingers, yet his look had changed to one of peaceful comprehension and wisdom beyond his years. The businessman across the room was lost in contemplation, staring blankly at the table after spending so much time on his phone. The woman beside the window, who had been stirring her coffee absently, halted abruptly, her eyes sparkling with tears that had not yet been shed. As though the weight of the discourse had become ingrained in her bones, even the barista, who had been racing through orders all day, paused her actions. A slight smile played at the corners of Morgan Freeman's lips as he sat back in his chair. He had witnessed this before, the instant when profoundly simple words changed a person's innermost thoughts. Liam's voice had become quieter as he glanced up at him. "So, even if no one remembers me, what I do still matters." Morgan nodded while maintaining a steady tone. "Especially then, kid." Liam smiled, a slight, inconspicuous smile, but one that was more profound than any outspoken statement could ever be. Morgan raised his coffee cup and sipped slowly as he made his way back to his mother, relishing the moment since it was genuine rather than ostentatious or dramatic. And that's all that matters sometimes. Through this story, we come to understand that a life well lived is determined by the silent impact we leave behind rather than by how many people remember our name. Liam entered the cafe with a straightforward query, but he left with something far more profound: the knowledge that kindness is about the impact we have on other people's lives rather than about being recognized. Morgan Freeman didn't merely respond to him. He revealed to him a truth that would never leave him. Ultimately, it's not about fame, fortune, or power. It has to do with how we treat other people. Because whether or not we leave the world a little better is ultimately more significant than whether or not it remembers us. At the top of form, bottom of form,